She was just a black woman in sweats, quietly watering her plants in her own mansion, until the cops showed up. They slammed her against the wall, mocked her accent, and handcuffed her in front of the staff, accusing her of breaking in. But what they didn't know, she wasn't just the owner, she was the first lady of the state. Her husband, the governor himself. And when he walked in, the room froze, phones rang, badges dropped, and careers ended on the spot. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story is already hitting home, make sure you hit that like button. Let's dive in. The morning sun cast a warm golden glow over the manicured lawns of the city's most exclusive neighborhood. It was a day like any other, quiet and serene. In the garden of a sprawling white-columned mansion, a woman named Naomi Walker moved with a gentle, unhurried rhythm. She wore simple gray yoga pants and a faded university sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a simple tie. The vibrant pinks and purples of the petunias seemed to brighten as she tended to them, her focus entirely on the delicate petals and the rich dark earth. This was her meditation, a small moment of normalcy, in a life that was anything but normal. The scent of damp soil and blooming flowers filled the air, a peaceful start to a day that was about to be shattered. Without any warning, the calm was ripped apart by the violent screech of tires against pavement. Two police squad cars, stark white and blue against the lush green of the neighborhood, pulled up abruptly, their doors flying open before the vehicles had even come to a complete stop. Out stormed two officers. The first, a man named Dean Murphy, moved with an aggressive, self-assured swagger. His jaw was set, his eyes already scanning Naomi with a dismissive glance that took in her casual clothes and instantly judged her. He was the kind of man who saw the world in simple, harsh lines, and in this neighborhood, a black woman in sweats did not fit into his picture of who belonged. His partner Jamie Lopez was younger, her movements more hesitant. She was a rookie, and her eyes darted from the grand mansion to the woman in the garden, a flicker of uncertainty already present in her expression. This was her third month on the job, and the reality of policing was proving to be a stark contrast to the ideals she had held at the academy. Murphy didn't wait for an explanation. He didn't ask a single question with any intent to listen. He stormed across the perfect lawn, his boots leaving imprints in the soft grass, his voice booming with authority. "Ma'am, step away from the property immediately," he commanded, his hand already resting on the handle of his service weapon. "We received a report of a break-in in progress." Naomi straightened up slowly, her hands holding a small gardening trowel. She felt a familiar weary tightness in her chest, the kind of tension she had spent years teaching about in university lecture halls. She had studied this moment, written about it, debated it with her students. Now, she was living it. She looked at the officer, her expression calm and measured. "Officer," she began, her voice even. "There must be some mistake. This is my home." Murphy let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a sound full of condescension, a sound that implied she was not only a liar but a foolish one. "Your home?" he repeated, drawing the words out as if they were a joke. He glanced at the towering white columns, the immaculate facade of the mansion, and then back at her simple clothes. "Right. And I'm the King of England. Ma'am, you need to tell us who you work for. Are you the cleaning staff? The gardener?" He gestured around with a flick of his wrist. "Did the homeowners give you permission to be out here?" Each question was a small jab, designed to belittle, to put her in her place. Naomi's patience, though vast, began to thin. "My name is Naomi Walker," she stated clearly, hoping the simple fact of a name might ground the situation in reality. But Murphy just scoffed, shaking his head. "Naomi Walker," he mimicked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Doesn't ring a bell. Look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way." Before she could utter another word, before she could explain the profound, monumental error he was making, he moved. In a swift, brutal motion, he grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back with practiced force. Naomi let out a sharp gasp, not of pain but of pure shock. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs snapping around her wrists echoed in the quiet morning air. It was a sound that sealed the injustice, a sound she knew all too well from her academic research but had never imagined she would hear directed at her. He shoved her forward, her body stumbling against the cold, hard marble of one of the mansion's support columns. The impact sent a dull thud through her shoulder. She was being arrested, slammed against the wall of her own home. Just then, the grand front door of the mansion swung open. The butler, a man named Arthur, who had served the family for over a decade, ran out, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. "Ma'am, what is happening?" he cried out, his voice trembling. He took a step toward Naomi, but Murphy immediately put up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Stay back, sir," Murphy ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. "This woman is under arrest for trespassing." Arthur stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing but no more words coming out. He looked from Naomi's cuffed hands to the aggressive stance of the officer, his mind unable to process the scene unfolding before him. He had seen Naomi host foreign dignitaries, command charity galas with grace, and advise her husband on matters of state. To see her treated this way, like a common criminal, was an absurdity that defied all logic. Beside Murphy, Officer Lopez watched with a growing sense of dread. Her stomach churned. The woman's calm demeanor, the butler's frantic panic, none of it aligned with the profile of a typical burglar. This felt wrong. Every instinct in her body screamed that they were making a terrible, irreversible mistake. But she was a rookie. Murphy was her training officer, and in the rigid hierarchy of law enforcement, silence was often mistaken for compliance. Inside the mansion, the scene became even more surreal, a grotesque play unfolding in the opulent foyer. Officer Murphy, puffed up with a sense of righteous victory, dragged Naomi across the polished marble floor. His grip on her arm was tight, bruising. The grand entrance hall, usually a place of quiet elegance with its high ceilings and sweeping staircase, was now a stage for her humiliation. Maria, the head housekeeper, was dusting a nearby console table when they entered. She looked up, and a sharp, horrified gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She had worked for Naomi for 5 years, and she knew her as a kind, respectful woman who always asked about her children. In the kitchen, a loud clatter broke the silence. The family's chef, a man renowned for his culinary artistry, had been prepping for lunch. At the sight of Naomi being manhandled by the police, the santoku knife he was holding slipped from his numb fingers and clattered loudly onto the granite countertop. He stood frozen, his face ashen, watching the scene with a mixture of fear and outrage. Murphy seemed to relish the audience. He saw their shocked faces not as a sign of his error, but as proof of his authority. He shoved Naomi toward a small, ornate bench in the corner of the foyer, forcing her to sit. "You see?" he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. He gestured at her as if she were an object lesson. "This is what happens when you think you can just walk into a place where you don't belong." He leaned in closer to Naomi, his voice dropping to a low, menacing sneer. "You should consider yourself lucky. In some places, a trespassing maid like you would have gotten shot first, with questions asked later. You're lucky we're the patient types." The words hung in the air, thick with prejudice and threat. Naomi's face was a study in controlled emotion. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to the sting of the humiliation, but her eyes remained fixed on Murphy, clear and unwavering. She was gathering data, observing, analyzing. This was no longer a random act of profiling. It was a case study in abuse of power, and she was the primary subject. Officer Jamie Lopez felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her gut. This was escalating far beyond a simple misunderstanding. The reactions of the staff were too genuine, too filled with personal shock. Burglars didn't elicit this kind of loyalty and fear from the household staff. "Murphy," she began, her voice quiet but firm, "are we absolutely sure about this? Maybe we should just verify her identity before we call it in." Murphy shot her a look of pure annoyance, a glare that told her she was crossing a line. "Don't get soft, rookie," he snapped, his voice sharp and dismissive. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know a trespasser when I see one. She fits the profile perfectly. Now stand by and wait for backup. Let her explain her story to the sergeant downtown." Lopez bit her lip, silencing the protest that was rising in her throat. She knew arguing further would only get her a black mark on her record. But she couldn't just stand there. As Murphy turned his back to radio for transport, Maria, the housekeeper, seized her chance. She crept over to Lopez, her hands trembling. "That's her house," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "That is Mrs. Walker. She is the governor's wife." The words hit Jamie Lopez with the force of a physical blow. The governor's wife. Her eyes widened in panic, her mind racing to connect the dots. The mansion, the staff's reaction, the woman's unshakable calm. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. She looked over at Murphy, who was still talking into his radio with smug satisfaction, completely oblivious. She looked at Naomi, who met her gaze with a knowing, almost pitying look. A cold dread washed over Lopez. This wasn't just a mistake, this was a career-ending, city-shaking catastrophe in the making. She knew she had to do something, but her training, her fear of Murphy, and the sheer shock of the revelation kept her rooted to the spot. Her mind was a whirlwind of what-ifs and oh-my-gods. Outside, unseen by the officers in the foyer, the quiet street was disturbed by the smooth, silent arrival of a sleek black SUV. It pulled up to the curb behind the squad cars, its tinted windows hiding the identity of the person inside. The vehicle's engine purred with a quiet power, a stark contrast to the noisy chaos unfolding within the mansion walls. A storm was coming, and Officer Dean Murphy had no idea he was standing directly in its path. Just a few days earlier, in the quiet study of the same mansion, the scene had been entirely different. Naomi sat across from her husband, Governor James Walker, a man whose public persona was one of unshakable authority and political savvy. In private, however, he was simply James, a man who listened to his wife not as a political asset, but as his intellectual and emotional equal. The room was filled with books, many of them on law, history, and social justice. "James, I need to do this," Naomi had said, her tone earnest and determined. "I want to feel what it's really like. I'm writing this paper on the daily realities of racial profiling, and I can't do it from an ivory tower, surrounded by a security detail." She gestured around the luxurious room. "This isn't the real world for most people in our community. I need to understand it from the ground up." She had been a respected criminal justice professor before James's political career had taken flight, an activist who fought for reform from the outside. Now as First Lady, she felt a different kind of responsibility, to use her unique position to shed light on the very systems she once critiqued from afar. James had listened, his brow furrowed with concern. He was a man accustomed to managing risk, to controlling variables. The idea of his wife intentionally making herself vulnerable was deeply unsettling. "Naomi, it's too dangerous," he argued, his voice gentle but firm. "You are the First Lady of this state. What if someone recognizes you? What if something happens?" Naomi had offered a small, confident smile. "Outside of a televised press conference or a formal gala, no one will recognize me," she assured him. "I'll dress down. I'll drive my own car. I'll be just another face in the crowd. I've already spoken to the staff. They are to treat me as a regular guest, no special treatment. It's the only way to get an honest perspective." She saw the hesitation still lingering in his eyes. "This isn't about me wanting to be normal for the sake of it, James. It's about the work. How can I advocate for change if I don't truly understand the problem as it exists today for an ordinary black woman?" He knew that look in her eyes. It was the same determination that had drawn him to her years ago, the fierce intelligence and unwavering commitment to justice that made her more than just a partner, but a guiding force in his own life. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He trusted her judgment, even when it made him profoundly anxious. "All right," he said finally, his voice laced with reluctance. "But you call me if anything feels wrong, anything at all." She had agreed, and for the past few days, she had lived her experiment, moving through the city with a quiet anonymity, observing, listening, and taking notes for the paper that she hoped would make a real difference. She had no idea her research was about to become so vividly, painfully practical. Back in the present, the cold reality of her experiment had settled in the grand foyer. Officer Jamie Lopez was trapped in a whirlwind of doubt and fear. The housekeeper's words echoed in her mind. She is the governor's wife. Lopez looked again at the woman on the bench. Naomi Walker sat with a stillness that was utterly at odds with her situation. She wasn't fighting, she wasn't screaming, she wasn't pleading. Her calm was more unnerving than any protest would have been. It was the calm of someone who knew something the others didn't. Someone who was simply waiting for the inevitable outcome. Lopez's mind raced, replaying the events of the last 10 minutes. The vague break-in report from an anonymous caller, likely a nosy neighbor who saw a black woman where they didn't expect one. Murphy's immediate, baseless aggression. The staff's horrified, panicked reactions. She glanced around the room and noticed the small, discreet security cameras mounted near the ceiling corners. They were on. Everything. Murphy's condescending words, the physical assault, the illegal arrest was being recorded. Her heart sank even further. This was a disaster of epic proportions. She had to do something. She couldn't let Murphy call this in and transport a handcuffed First Lady to the downtown precinct. The fallout would be unimaginable, not just for them, but for the entire department. Acting on a surge of desperate adrenaline, Lopez approached the housekeeper, Maria, who was hovering nervously by the staircase. "Ma'am," Lopez whispered, trying to keep her voice steady, "is there any way you can get me her identification? A driver's license. Anything with her name and photo on it?" Maria nodded quickly, grateful for the chance to do something, anything, to help. "Yes, of course. It's in the house safe. I have the code." She scurried away up the grand staircase, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet runner. Lopez held her breath, her eyes darting nervously toward Murphy, who was still boasting about his sharp instincts to the shell-shocked butler. A few agonizingly long minutes later, Maria came rushing back down, a small, official-looking card in her hand. She pressed it into Lopez's palm. Lopez's hand trembled as she looked at it. It was a state ID card. The photo showed Naomi Walker, poised and smiling, the same woman who now sat in handcuffs just a few feet away. And there, in clear, bold letters, was her name, Naomi Walker. Below it, an address. This address. A wave of nausea washed over Lopez. It was true. It was all true. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She walked over to her partner, her legs feeling like lid. "Murphy," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Murphy, listen to me. I think we've made a huge mistake." She held out the ID card, a piece of plastic that held the power to detonate their careers. But Murphy didn't even glance at it. He waved a dismissive hand, his arrogance blinding him to the impending doom. "A mistake? The only mistake was her thinking she could get away with this," he scoffed. "It's too late for that now, Lopez. We've already got her detained. Let her explain her fancy fake ID to the booking sergeant downtown." He turned his back on her again, effectively ending the conversation. Panic set in. Lopez knew she couldn't force him to look. She couldn't override her training officer. But she could create evidence. With a shaking hand, she pulled out her personal cell phone, making sure Murphy wasn't looking. She quickly snapped a clear, time-stamped photo of the ID card. It was a small act of defiance, a desperate attempt to protect herself from the storm she knew was about to break. It was a piece of proof that she had tried, that she had known, just in case. Outside, the door of the black SUV opened with a quiet, solid thud. Governor James Walker stepped out. He was dressed in a sharp navy blazer, his posture radiating a calm and controlled power that was far more intimidating than any outburst of rage could ever be. He had been on his way to a municipal luncheon when his chief of staff had patched through an urgent, frantic call from Arthur, the butler. "Sir, you need to come home immediately. There's been an incident. The police. They've arrested your wife." James's blood had run cold, but his expression remained a mask of impenetrable calm. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Panic was for people without a plan. He immediately ended the call with Arthur and dialed his chief of staff. His instructions were rapid, precise, and chillingly clear. "Cancel the luncheon. Assemble the press for a conference at the residence in 1 hour. Get the police commissioner on the phone and tell him to meet me here. Now. Then get the state attorney general on the line. Tell her I have a developing situation involving a civil rights violation." There was no panic in his voice, only the quiet, deadly efficiency of a man who knew exactly which levers of power to pull, and in what order. As he walked toward the mansion, his long, confident strides eating up the distance, the butler, Arthur, rushed to meet him on the porch, his face pale and etched with distress. "Sir, I am so sorry," Arthur stammered. She was trying to explain. She told them it was her home, but they wouldn't listen to her. They put her in handcuffs. James placed a reassuring hand on the older man's shoulder. "It's not your fault, Arthur. You did the right thing by calling me." He walked past the butler and toward the heavy oak doors of his home. He didn't need to knock. He didn't need to announce himself. Inside the foyer, the air was thick with tension. Officer Murphy was still pontificating, his voice echoing in the large space. Naomi sat on the bench, her back straight, her gaze fixed on the front door. And then she heard it. A sound as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, the sound of her husband's footsteps. The steady rhythmic cadence of his dress shoes on the marble floor. It was the sound of order about to be restored, of chaos about to be disciplined. And for the first time since the squad cars had screeched to a halt, a small knowing smile touched Naomi Walker's lips. The cavalry hadn't just arrived. The entire army was here. Officer Dean Murphy was in the middle of a self-congratulatory speech, lecturing the terrified household staff on the importance of reporting suspicious activity. "You see, this is a perfect example," he was saying, gesturing broadly toward Naomi. "You can't be too careful these days. You don't just let people like this wander around rich homes, no matter what kind of story they tell you. It takes a trained eye, a professional instinct, to see through the lies." He was so engrossed in his own voice, so blinded by his own perceived brilliance, that he didn't notice the change in the room at first. He didn't notice how the chef and the housekeeper suddenly stood up straighter. He didn't see the flicker of sheer, unadulterated terror in his rookie partner's eyes. He didn't feel the sudden, dramatic drop in temperature as a chilling silence fell over the entire foyer. The room froze. Every person in it, except for Murphy, seemed to hold their breath at once. Then, Murphy saw him. A tall, impeccably dressed man had entered the room, moving with an aura of absolute command. James Walker walked in, his eyes sweeping over the scene, taking in his wife in handcuffs, the two officers, the frightened staff. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. Officer Lopez went completely pale, her skin turning a ghostly white. It was as if she had seen a ghost who happened to be the most powerful man in the state. The butler, Arthur, finally found his voice, stepping forward to address his employer. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling but clear, "I'm so sorry." She was trying to explain everything to them, but they simply wouldn't listen. Murphy, still oblivious, turned to face the newcomer with an air of annoyance. Who was this guy in a fancy suit, interrupting his arrest? "And you are?" Murphy asked, his tone dismissive and impatient, the words hanging in the air with a fatal arrogance. He was about to tell the man to step back and mind his own business. Before Murphy could finish his sentence, James Walker reached into his blazer, but he didn't pull out a wallet or a phone. He pulled out a small leather-bound case and flipped it open. Inside, a gleaming gold badge shone under the light of the foyer's chandelier. It wasn't a police badge, it was something far more powerful. "I'm James Walker," he said, his voice low, steady, and laced with ice, "governor of this state, and you are standing in my house, with my wife in handcuffs." The words landed like hammer blows in the silent room. Murphy's smug expression dissolved in an instant, replaced by a look of pure, slack-jawed shock. His brain seemed to short-circuit, unable to process the information. The governor, the woman in sweats, his wife. The color drained from his face. He literally stumbled backward, his body lurching as if he'd been physically pushed. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked from the governor's badge to Naomi's calm, smiling face, and the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. In that moment, he realized he hadn't just made a mistake, he had committed professional suicide. Naomi looked directly at him, her smile gone, replaced by an expression of cold judgment. "You really should have listened," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. The full weight of the situation crashed down on everyone in the room. For Officer Jamie Lopez, it was a moment of terrifying vindication. She was stunned speechless, her mind a chaotic blur of relief and fear. Relief that she had been right, that her instincts had been screaming the truth at her. Fear for what was about to happen to her partner, to her entire precinct. She looked at Naomi Walker, now not just a victim of profiling, but the First Lady, a woman of immense power and influence, and she felt a profound sense of awe. All around them, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted dramatically. The household staff who had been shrinking in fear just moments before, now stood taller. A quiet confidence returned to their posture. They exchanged small, knowing glances. Maria, the housekeeper who had fetched the ID, subtly pulled out her phone and shielding it with her body began to record. She knew this was a moment that needed to be documented, a moment of justice that the world needed to see. Governor James Walker turned his full attention to the trembling Officer Murphy. His voice, though still quiet, was now sharp as a razor's edge. "Officer," he began, "on what grounds, precisely, was my wife being arrested?" Murphy, still reeling, tried to compose himself, fumbling to find the legal jargon that was his usual shield. "Sir, Governor, we had a report of a trespasser. She was non-compliant, unable to provide identification." His voice trailed off as he saw the state ID card still clutched in Lopez's hand. He knew he was caught in a lie. James didn't let him finish his stammering excuse. "Unable to provide ID, or unwilling to accept it," he countered, his eyes flicking for a split second to Officer Lopez. He then pulled out his own phone, dialed a number and put it on speaker. The entire room could hear the phone ring, once before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Mr. Governor, this is Attorney General Davison. You said it was urgent?" James's gaze never left Murphy's face. "Janet, it is," he said, his voice hard as steel. "I'm standing in my own home, looking at a clear-cut case of wrongful arrest and a major civil rights violation, personally witnessed by me, and the entire incident, from the moment the officers arrived, has been recorded on my mansion's high-definition security cameras." A sharp intake of breath was audible on the other end of the line. Murphy's face, if possible, grew even paler. He looked like a man who had just been told his own execution was scheduled for sunrise. It was then that Naomi spoke again, her voice cutting through the thick tension. "James," she said calmly, getting to her feet. She nodded her head slightly toward the younger officer. "And this rookie," she said, making sure everyone, especially the governor and the attorney general on the phone, heard her clearly. "Officer Lopez." She tried to speak up. She questioned the arrest. She knew something was wrong. She looked directly at Lopez, whose eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "Remember that," Naomi finished, her words a clear directive. It was an act of grace in the middle of a reckoning, a moment where she separated the guilty from the merely compliant. Murphy was now visibly sweating, beads of perspiration forming on his forehead and upper lip. The entire world he had built for himself, a world where his badge gave him unquestionable authority, was crumbling to dust at his feet. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Within minutes, the quiet, tree-lined street outside the governor's mansion was swarming with official vehicles. The police commissioner himself arrived, his face grim and tight with anxiety. He had broken every traffic law to get there, his mind racing with the political nightmare that was unfolding. He walked into the foyer, took one look at the scene, the governor on the phone with the attorney general, the First Lady standing calmly with her hands still cuffed behind her back, and Officer Murphy sweating under the weight of his own stupidity, and knew that heads were going to roll. The commissioner walked over to Naomi and personally uncuffed her, his hands trembling slightly as he did. "Mrs. Walker, on behalf of the entire department, I am so sorry," he stammered. James ended his call with the Attorney General, who had confirmed that a full-scale civil investigation was being launched, effective immediately. The commissioner turned to Murphy, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Officer Murphy, you are immediately suspended, pending termination. Hand me your badge and service weapon, now." Murphy, his face a mess of disbelief and panic, finally found his voice. He turned to Naomi, his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Ma'am, Mrs. Walker, please. I made a mistake. I am so sorry. It was a misunderstanding. His apology was pathetic, a desperate last-ditch effort to save himself. Naomi looked at him, her expression unreadable, her calm demeanor more damning than any angry outburst. "Save it for the court," she said simply, her words cutting him off at the knees. There was no forgiveness in her voice, only the cold, hard finality of justice. The commissioner then turned to Officer Lopez, who was still standing by, pale and silent. The governor stepped forward. "Commissioner," James said, his voice firm, "your rookie officer showed moral instinct and attempted to de-escalate this situation. Her actions have been noted." He gave Lopez a nod of acknowledgement, a small gesture that likely saved her career. Lopez could only manage a choked, "Thank you, sir." The mansion staff, who had witnessed the entire drama, could no longer contain their relief. A quiet cheer went through them, a ripple of applause for their boss, for Naomi. Outside, the neighbor who had been quietly recording the initial arrest from their window had already uploaded the video. It spread across social media like a wildfire. The clip of a black woman being slammed against the wall of a mansion, followed by a second clip of the governor himself arriving, was an explosive combination. The comments section erupted in a firestorm of outrage and disbelief. "Are you kidding me? They arrested the First Lady of the state on her own property?" one comment read. "This is insane. Imagine what would have happened if she weren't married to the governor," said another. The public was furious, not just for Naomi, but for every person of color who had ever faced the same humiliating assumption. The story wasn't just about one woman's wrongful arrest. It was a glaring spotlight on a systemic problem that everyone knew existed, but had rarely seen laid so bare. The following day, the story was the only thing anyone was talking about. It led every news broadcast. It was on the front page of every newspaper. The governor's office had called a press conference, and the lawn of the mansion was packed with reporters, news vans, and photographers. A podium had been set up, and when Governor James Walker stepped up to the microphones, he was not alone. To his right stood his wife, Naomi, poised and powerful. To his left stood Officer Jamie Lopez, looking nervous but resolute in her crisp, formal uniform. The message was clear. This was a united front. "Yesterday, an event occurred at my home that was deeply disturbing," James began, his voice ringing with authority across the assembled crowd. "But I want to be very clear. This is not about what happened to my wife. She has the platform and the resources to fight this injustice." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This is about what would have happened if she were any other black woman in this state. A woman without a powerful husband, without a direct line to the Attorney General. It's about the person who would have been taken downtown, charged, and left to navigate a system that was already stacked against them." The crowd murmured in agreement. The cameras flashed relentlessly. The backlash against Officer Murphy's department had been swift and brutal. The police chief had already issued a public apology, but it did little to quell the growing public anger. Then, Naomi stepped up to the podium. A hush fell over the crowd. She spoke not as a victim, but as the professor and activist she had always been. Her voice was strong, filled with a passion that came from years of study and a lifetime of experience. "Profiling doesn't ask for your job title," she said, her words clear and direct. "It doesn't care about your education or your contributions to your community. It sees only the color of your skin and makes an assumption about your worth." She looked directly into the sea of cameras. The uniform that Officer Murphy wore gave him power, but he confused that power with permission to dehumanize, to degrade, and to deny a person their basic dignity. That is not the purpose of law enforcement. As she finished speaking, the crowd erupted in a massive wave of applause. It was a powerful, electrifying moment. In the days that followed, the consequences continued to unfold. Officer Dean Murphy was officially fired. The police commissioner, under immense pressure, announced a mandatory, statewide reform program focused on de-escalation and implicit bias training, a program he asked Naomi to help design. Justice, it seemed, was not just being served, it was being engineered for the future. Weeks turned into months. The story of Naomi Walker's arrest became a defining moment for the state. It sparked conversations in homes, in workplaces, and in community centers. For Naomi, life returned to a new kind of normal. She resumed her work with a renewed sense of purpose, now leading a newly formed statewide commission on law enforcement accountability. Her academic paper on profiling was no longer just a paper, it was now backed by the full force of the governor's office, a blueprint for tangible change. Officer Jamie Lopez, praised for her integrity, was promoted. She was moved out of patrol and given a new role as a community liaison, tasked with rebuilding the broken trust between the police department and the neighborhoods it served. She became a symbol of a new kind of policing, one that valued intuition and humanity over blind obedience. One afternoon, as Naomi was sorting through her mail, she found a small handwritten letter. It was from a young black girl from one of the city's tougher neighborhoods. The handwriting was neat, the words full of a hope that brought tears to Naomi's eyes. "Dear Mrs. Walker," the letter began, "I saw you on the news. My mom said you were very brave. Before I saw you, I didn't know that people who look like me could live in a big house like that. Because of you, I believe I can own a mansion too one day." Naomi clutched the letter to her chest, a potent reminder of why she had undertaken her dangerous experiment in the first place. It was for this girl, for all the girls like her. The story closed on a quiet afternoon, much like the one on which it had begun. Naomi was back in her garden, tending to her roses. The sun was warm on her skin, the scent of the blossoms sweet in the air. This time, as neighbors walked by, they smiled and waved. This time, no one questioned who she was or whether she belonged. She was no longer just a woman in sweats. She was a force for change, a symbol of resilience, and the first lady of the state, right where she belonged. Respect isn't about uniforms or badges. It's about recognizing the fundamental humanity in every single person. And some power doesn't need to be shouted. It doesn't wear a badge or carry a weapon. It wears patience, and it wins in the end. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.